Okay. The record. This meeting is being recorded for posterity. Okay. Let's see if we can keep the line open. So it hit me first in the sexual region, and then it hit me in the head and heart, which was the psychedelic aspect of it. So many things have been said about the 60s and about the promiscuity and orgies among the hippies, about the concept of free love, which was a term at the time. And all I can do is tell you the truth of my experience about that. I never participated in any hippie orgies. I never even ever had a hippie girlfriend as such. I didn't like them. I didn't find them attractive. But I had a strong sexual drive, as most adolescents do. And I came from a small town culture in Maine where sex among teenagers was extremely taboo. And I had suffered a lot from that taboo, a lot. So there were two great problems with sexuality in my adolescence. I graduated from high school in 1963. One of them was, it just wasn't right for religious or social reasons for young people to be free to experiment sexually. And their birth control hadn't come into the picture quite yet. And the second deterrent was birth control. There was an absolute terror over the notion in my high school years that if you had sex, it was going to lead to conception. The girl would get pregnant and then you were hooked for the rest of your life. And I certainly didn't want that. So I'll start out with what I wanted and what I found. And I don't think I'm atypical in this respect. I wanted the freedom to be able to find out what sex was all about, to experiment, if you want to use that word. And I wanted to be able to flirt and to have fun, enjoy myself, and have pleasure with young women, including sexual pleasure. And I wanted to have it without that terrible fear of conception and without social condemnation. That's all I wanted. And what teenager doesn't want that? You see? So in that respect, I was really typical. So I didn't get that in high school. And I didn't get that in college, although my first sexual experience was in college in Maine in 1963. I think it was October, with a college girl. She had already graduated. She was a few years older than me. And I met her actually because she was the secretary of my mentor in college, C.F. Terrell, a man who took me under his wing when I dropped out, eventually got expelled, but we became friends for life. He's an important figure in my life. So she was his secretary. That's how we connected. But it was a terrible experience for me. I wasn't prepared. I didn't know what to do. It was horrible. And so then I left the United States. Now, this is another important point. From May of 64 until October of 66, for about 2.5 years, I split, as we used to say. And so I wasn't in the United States at that time when the revolution really started to gain a lot of steam. I was all over the world. I traveled to Europe first, then to Greece, the Middle East, Egypt. Then I got, by an extraordinary series of events. I got to work a deckhand on a freighter that went from Eilat in Israel. Yes, I've been to Israel, to Yokohama. So I ended up in the Far East. Japan, I lived 2 times. And so everything, you know, Manila, Hong Kong, Singapore, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. Then I went to India, Nepal. And all that was during the time when the 60s was peaking in my generation. So I wasn't really there at that time. But I did encounter LSD for the first time in Madras, India in 1966. That's the first time that I took it. And then when I came back to the States later in 67, I took it some more times. But getting back to the sexual theme, it was difficult for me to connect with girls, even though I liked them and I craved their company and I craved the sexual thrill and the affection. It was really hard. So during those 3 years, in fact, I only had, I think, one sexual encounter with a Japanese girl when I was in Tokyo. And that was pretty crazy. And again, one of the things that I would take away from my lessons and trials and torments, and there were many, was that a sane society in the future and in the beauty to come must provide sexual initiation to teenagers. And this is, correct me, but I don't think I have heard anyone ever make that proposal or talk about that.
Well,
what do you say?
Well, we know of it from old cultures.
Yeah, presumably we hear that.
Well,
yes.
we hear that, but no, we certainly don't get that, and we usually fumble. I mean, as you're describing it, I'm shaking my head in affirmation that, you know, my own sexual experiences as a young person parallel yours in many ways, and the rawness of it is very heartwarming. I mean, you know, it's very real to me.
I think it's extremely common, Catherine, and Kathleen, excuse me. And you know, it's so important that young boys be initiated so that when they finally have that long awaited moment, they have discernment, they have skills, they know what to do, they know how to behave correctly, you know, to be taught what I call sexual manners is absolutely essential to the future of our species and the well-being of society, you see. Now, what was happening in the 60s during the time I was on my mystical quest around the world was, of course, the great outbreak of the sexual revolution. And when I came back in 66 and 67 and 68, it was all over the place. But I couldn't relate to that because the fact that my generation had somehow been sprung out of prison, you know, the prison of adolescent sexuality, without any knowledge of what to do with it, didn't help me at all, you see. So I never participated in any of that whatsoever. I had to find my way to my own particular path of sexual experimentation. I keep using that word, but it is the correct word. And it was a solitary path, but eventually I did get on it. Actually got on it in Santa Fe, in the land of enchantment. And how fitting that is, because it is enchantment. Sexual desire, the thrill, it's a form of enchantment, it's a form of magic. It's a great source of beauty. And the erotic capacity of the human animal is off the charts. But it's something that you have to know how to handle. So basically what I did, I'd had a number of sexual encounters by the time I got to Santa Fe. Got to Santa Fe on July 4th in 1972, and I couldn't believe where I was. Not only was it the most beautiful town and setting and environment that I'd ever been in, but it was a place where the social life was just fabulous. And it was the first time in my experience that I had a social life, you see? Because I lived in the old part of Santa Fe. And when I got there were probably 50,000. It probably had a population of 50, 55,000. But if you only lived in the old part of Santa Fe, around the plaza and up Canyon Road and up Camino de Montesol and all there, you were in a community of maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people. We all knew each other. We all worked in the same places, cafes, boutiques, plant nurseries. And there were ample opportunities to meet women. Plus the fact that I was starting my career as a practicing astrologer at that time.
Oh,
And needless to say, most of my clients were women. But I had a rule that I didn't connect sexually with my clients. I only made one exception to that rule through the years. So to make a long story short, I was in an ideal setting in Santa Fe to have what I had been looking for. And by having a number of encounters, girlfriends, whatever you want to call them, you know, today, what would they call them? You know what they would call them today?
what do they call them today?
Fuck buddies.
No way.
Yes, they do.
Wow. We've descended into
We
a
have degenerated seriously.
pretty miserable place. Wow. That's
Yeah.
horrific.
It's not exactly a charming term. That's what you'd call them today. So I had a number of girlfriends over the time I lived in Santa Fe. And both times, because I went to LA for a while. That was a horrible sexual wasteland. My sexual experiences in LA, with a couple of exceptions, were gruesome.
Wow.
The atmosphere in LA was not like the enchanted atmosphere in Santa Fe, right? Anyway, by having the opportunity to do that I'd always wanted to do, I began to find out about my own sexuality and what sex is and Tantra is and what kind of energy that is and what we can do with it and how not to use it wrongly. And I was fortunate because I didn't use it wrongly, as far as I know. And the girlfriends that I had over those years, both in the first and second time I lived in Santa Fe, were just lovely. And we had a kind of a pact. I would call it now a pleasure pact, using the language of Tantra. Tantra is a pleasure pact. Love is not necessarily a pleasure pact. So it begs the question, well, you know, what is the relationship between love and sex? And this is a deep question, and I was very involved in working that out, trying to figure that out. But most of the girlfriends I had, I remember with great fondness. We were really affectionate with each other. We liked each other. We enjoyed each other's company. We went out dancing. We went out endlessly to Mexican restaurants. We walked around in the hills of the Sangre de Cristos. And many of them knew each other, you know. They worked in boutiques, in waitresses in restaurants. They all knew each other, and they all knew that we mingled in that way. But there was a respect, and there was a consideration that we were free to do that, and that we were doing it in a way that was not promiscuous, or it had nothing to do with that whole aura of promiscuity and free sex that permeated the generation, you see. So I was on a completely different sexual path during those years.
And John, would you say that, like in nature, there are so many different ecosystems? When you talked about LA, could you use that same terminology and say that LA had its own sexual ecosystem and Santa Fe had its own sexual ecosystem? And if that's at all apt, can you maybe?
I think that's a brilliant way to frame the situation, and certainly fits my circumstances, you know. Like in LA, for instance, women that I met in LA, well, it was nothing compared to that atmosphere of congeniality and affection that I had experienced in Santa Fe. And I can only think of a couple of occasions where the sexual encounter, as I like to call it, that's my euphemism, was really, really great. And one sign that it is really good, there are several signs that it is really good. First of all, there's respect. And then there is the mutual knowledge, the mutual understanding between the man and the woman, the boy and the girl, that this is for pleasure and enjoyment, that it doesn't have a lot of baggage loaded on it, and that it doesn't mean a life commitment, but it does involve another kind of commitment. One of the principal things that I've learned through all those years is that, I'm talking about heterosexual intercourse and heterosexual play here, is that sex is an intimate act, but it is not an intimate bond. And this is a really important distinction. So somehow back then, and it looks almost miraculous now as I look back at it, I did have the good fortune to have some encounters on that understanding. We weren't out to get each other. We weren't out to form life partnerships. But the things that we shared together were as profound and rich as anything that could happen in a long-term life partnership. Do you see that?
Yes. And so, John, what are the elements that made that up? And in asking that question, what was it about New Mexico, the land of enchantment, of Santa Fe, of the people, the women you encountered there, that seemed to bring that element forward in a not in an isolated, but in a wide range of experiences? What was the catalyst going on there in the environment?
Beauty. Beauty is what it's all about. You know, one thing you could say about pornography, we're not going to go there, but I would mention this. Of course, there's a vast spectrum of pornography, and but there is one band in the spectrum of pornography, which is nothing but filming of heterosexual intercourse and various other acts of pleasure, which people do without being filmed. And you could say that trouble with pornography is that it portrays those acts, which are acts of beauty, pleasure, and affection, in an ugly way.
Yeah.
But as I said, I don't want to argue about pornography, but I will make this one other point and then we'll leave it behind. People sometimes say watching pornography, and again, I'm only talking about what I call natural heterosexual acts that couples do all the time. I'm not talking about any of the other stuff, right? The trouble with it is that young men in particular, when they watch pornography and then they get a chance to hook up, as they say today, connect with a real life girl, well, it isn't like what they see in pornography, so they can't get with it, right? Have you heard that?
Yes.
Well, that's completely wrong. Completely wrong. As a matter of fact, what people do in pornography is done in real life without pornography. And why shouldn't it be? So why shouldn't those acts performed in a certain way with respect, with care and affection, why they happen in real life, even when they're not filmed, in case you didn't get that, right? And so that's unfortunate that we hear this story about the taste of young men, particularly. I think it's a very different story with young women, but their taste for genuine sexual encounters with real girls being ruined. But I don't buy that, you see. It's a difficult subject, so let's sideline that for a minute,
Well,
okay?
Oh, okay, but just before we do, John, I mean, one of the things that happens in the sacredness of that experience, it's private. I mean, if we're talking about, just this intercourse and this lovemaking between two people. So as soon as you put it into film and there's a voyeuristic nature about it, it changes it. So
Well, I take your point.
There's an alchemy that happens, and so in that sense, it's something completely different. It's like scratching at the shell of an egg of a baby chick that's about to hatch. And if you do that enough, you kill it. And that's a little bit of what happens from my experience and my perspective with pornography. It's taken something totally sacred, something rich and full of life and natural and intricately connected with nature, and it's destroyed.
Yeah, it's displayed it in an inappropriate and ugly way.
Yeah.
So I totally take your point there. I'm glad that you brought that up, because that is a really good insight into the problem. But let's move away from the subject of pornography and get back to, you use the words sacred and private. And these are key words. Now, I don't know about the word sacred is kind of corrupted and tricky, but I looked a lot into the subject of sacred sexuality. And there are some who would argue that basically sexuality is a sacred right. And there are great and long, centuries long traditions in the pagan and non-Christian cultures that prove that to be the case, you see. So there is a sacred aspect to it. I don't think too much about, I don't, let's say, endorse turning it into any kind of religion or anything. I myself never practiced tantric sex as such. I never followed any of the teachers of that or followed the Kama Sutra or anything like that. I found that all to be unnatural, stilted, artificial, orchestrated. It wasn't spontaneous. So I haven't been interested in my sexual quest. I wasn't attracted in that direction. No, I was just attracted by the beauty and the pleasure of it and the wonderful opportunity to enjoy the company of a woman in that way and to be enjoyed. That's all I was looking for. But again, I didn't want to be facing a risk that was going to lead to something that would then bind me into commitments in life that I didn't want, and quite frankly, I wouldn't have been able to handle. Clear enough?
Yes, very clear. Thank you.
So let's see. What else can we say about the sexual revolution
Well,
before we move on to LSD?
let me ask you this. So maybe just a little history of how did this sexual revolution happen? I mean, you were saying you were away from the US while this was happening, but it was obviously a fundamental explosion in the United States. I was 16 in 1969, and I was in British Columbia that summer in Vancouver, and it was happening. You know, a little bit younger than you, but not by much, and experienced this remarkable flourishing of people just celebrating life. I mean, it wasn't like there was sex on every street corner or, you know, on every park bench, but there was a sense of being alive and being allowed to be alive in a way that I didn't experience when I went back home to Alberta after that summer in Vancouver, British Columbia. But so it was an
explosion, and no one has really adequately ever explained that explosion. But there are two interpretations. There are two ways, at least two, to explain it. I might just allude here to an astrological factor. I've studied planetary cycles over the years, long-term planetary cycles that go through the centuries. And when you plot these cycles out sort of on a graph, on a chronological scale of centuries, you kind of see them like sine curves. You see sine waves. And the point where the sine wave crosses the line of history is when a conjunction occurs. Now, there are three major cycles of these long-term conjunctions, and one of them is the conjunctions of Pluto and Uranus.
Yes.
And they only happen every 240 years. So there was in 1966 a conjunction of Pluto and Uranus. So you would have to go back 240 years to the moment of the previous one. Now, I've tracked these through history, and I've looked at the social trends, the events, the mores, and customs of the times, and I can see certain patterns. So in one way, I have to say that there was an explosion in 1966 of some kind of pulse that operates like a biorhythm in the human psyche, in the collective psyche. It was an extremely rare moment, and therefore something erupted. Now, the circumstances for that eruption were very special, because coming out of 1945, when I was born, coming out of the Second World War, the world had to redefine itself. There were the baby boomers generation. There were a lot of contributing factors to it. But I'm of the opinion, which many people contest, that there was something genuine and innate in this explosion of the desire for sexual freedom. And I stand by that view because sex is such an important factor in personal sanity, personal health and hygiene, and in the health of a society, that I regard it as a moment when there was a great boost to go in that direction. However, the other interpretation of the 60s is much more widespread. And according to that interpretation, the whole sexual revolution was staged and planned and promoted and hyped in an evil and degenerate way by certain influences in human society. That is certainly true. I don't deny that, but I do not agree that the sexual revolution in some form would not have happened if those nefarious and degenerating influences hadn't been present. You see my point?
That's very important to hear.
To me, it is extremely important. To anyone listening today, whatever your age may be, and I'm sure you're all younger than me, I was on the ground, and it was a ground force that came up, and it was genuine. But there is a tendency in human history for certain parasitical and psychopathic enemies of life to, in a way, foresee these natural developments and to go right in there and seize upon them and misdirect them, corrupt them, and pervert them. And this is a great tragedy because it happens over and over again. And I can say that in that respect, yeah, my generation was tragic.
And interesting. I mean, we're seeing that today. I mean, like you say,
we are indeed.
Anything.
We see it all over the place now. Yeah.
Everything and anything that has goodness about it, has vibrancy, life, and love. There appears to be a concerted effort to thwart that. I mean, we look today at the masking and the social distancing, and I mean, and we see that, and they're forcing that on 2-year-old children. And I mean, the criminality of all of it it's beyond words, truly.
Yeah, the enemies of life, these parasites among us, these aliens among us,
yeah,
they really are, hate life. They promote ugliness. They hate beauty. So one of the great lessons to take away, if you have the courage to look that in the face, is that it's not good enough just to be good. It's not good enough just to be a naive, innocent goy. It's not good enough. You also have to have the discernment of what is working against that, and you have to have the courage and the will to go at it. And we're at the end game in that battle right now. Look at what is being promoted through the COVID psyop. Everything that is against life. You can't dance, you can't make friends, you can't breathe.
You can't sing. You can't
sing.
gather. You can't gather musicians.
Yeah. What is all that about? How can there be anyone who hates all those common pleasures of life so much that they want to destroy them? And they're doing a pretty good job of it so far. Although I must say the resistance to them is probably greater than you hear about.
Well, I know you said that when we spoke previously in another interview, and I hang on to that because it's important to me to sense that that life and beauty and our basic evolutionary need for love and connection is stronger than the evil forces are.
Yes, it's much stronger.
Yes.
They have a lot of advantages, but they are fighting against what is natural and beautiful and deathless. And they cannot succeed. They cannot succeed.
And that's the aspect about sexuality and the explosion, as you put it, in the 60s revolution, that is so beautiful, because of course we have that heavy religious guilt and negativity that was laid upon people for control reasons, and yet we keep we keep shining through because we understand the beauty of it and the connected nature of it and the sacredness of it all. And and so here we are talking about this subject today, a year and a half into this whole pandemic of this COVID hoax, and 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 it's almost as if the subject of intimacy and sexuality has been kicked to the curb because we're all being taught to tether ourselves to what the next level of fear and the next level of control is. And sexuality, in so many ways, it's honor, respect, it's an abandonment, it's a sense of abandonment, it's a sense of just trusting in life. I don't know that those would be words that you would put to it, but we're at a time right now where embracing this, our sexuality and our connection with others, is ever more important. It takes,
certainly is.
It takes more courage and awareness than ever.
It certainly is. And it all comes back in the beauty to come. And it comes back better. Bring back beauty. This is what is happening. This is what this is all about. It's the greatest challenge ever faced by the human races. But the payoff of this challenge and the benefit is also the greatest that has ever come down through history. So on that note, let's move a little bit toward the subject of LSD and the psychedelic aspect, okay?
Sounds good.
So as I said, these were two different tracks in my life. My personal sexual quest, as I call it. Everyone's on a sexual quest, whether they know it or not. And my encounter with psychoactive plants and drugs. Now, I never use the word drugs. I never did drugs. I hated marijuana. I hated the hippie marijuana smoking scene. So did Jan Kerouac, was my close companion during those years. We completely shunned the hippies. We never did anything together. I never did LSD with Jan. When I met her, she was 14. She had already taken it 12 times.
Wow.
Yeah. And so we had our own path. And as I said, the first time I took LSD was when I was far away from the country in India. So then when I came back to New York City, where I met Jan in January of '67, LSD was going around. And it was a thing. And there were hippies all over the place. But there was a big LSD scene. I never went to any LSD parties. I never took LSD with anyone else. I always took it alone. But I want to tell you something about an example of how it was for me, okay? I had been in New York, having come back from Asia, and I wanted to take some more LSD. So I was in the Lower East Side, and I asked around, and I got a name, and I got a connection. And somebody told me, and they said, well, if you go over there to that apartment, there's a guy, and he has Sandoz, S-A-N-D-O-Z. Now, you may not know, if you don't know the history of the 60s, that Sandoz Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland, produced some millions and millions of doses of LSD that were circulated in the United States and Europe until 1966, when the government outlawed LSD. And if you could get Sandoz, you had the best stuff. Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD, worked for the Sandoz laboratory. Everyone should go and read the story. If you want to know about my generation, go read his book about LSD, my wonder child, as he called it, my Wunderkind. Okay? So I went there. This is a scene from the time. I'm going to his apartment, walk in, don't know the guy. He doesn't know me. There was a lot of pressure at that time for other things, mainly for marijuana and hash. But LSD was just at the point of being made illegal. So we were cautious. We looked at each other, body language, looked each other in the eyes. Cool. So I got out a $5 bill. I handed it to him, held out my hand. He put a tab in my hand like this, put his hand on mine, and he said, "May you see the clear light."
Oh, beautiful.
So that one incident tells you a lot. It tells you about that group of people at that time of my generation who knew that changing their consciousness with LSD was a sacred act, and that everyone who did it correctly had the same experience with light. You see? Now, other people were taking LSD. I mean, there was a place on Avenue A called the Psychedelic. Okay. And you could go over to the Psychedelic at 4 in the morning and you would see hippies wandering all around the street, blasted out on LSD. But I never did that. I never wanted to. And there were many people who did not do it in that way. They did it in a sacred and respectful manner, you see. So I continued to take LSD. Jan and I never took it together. We never did anything. I never did drugs. I tried DMT once. I hated it. Cocaine hadn't come in yet. I smoked a fair amount of hash. Guilty as charged. Okay. I had learned to smoke hash in India. And I had some of the best hash you could ever get, which I bought in Nepal. And I liked hash because it's very cerebral, and I'm a very cerebral dude. I hated marijuana. Jen and I never smoked hash together. We just didn't. We weren't in the scene. So 2 stages, I would say, in my education about cognitive liberty. This is what it's about, my friends. It's about the freedom to change and explore your own consciousness. That is one of the absolute basic freedoms for the human animal. But again, it takes discipline. You have to handle it correctly and do it knowing that it is a sacred undertaking, because your consciousness is sacred. And where did you ever get to be conscious in the first place? Who gave you the gift of consciousness and awareness? When you decide to experiment with that, then you are in effect accepting that it has been given to you by a higher power, by a higher divine intelligence gave you your consciousness, but you also have the liberty to experiment with that gift. So I did that. But that's not mushrooms. Now, mushrooms are another subject, and mushrooms have played a great, great part in my life since the 60s. But I didn't really encounter them in the 60s. I did my LSD trips by myself, saw the clear light, also saw what I now call the white light, the organic light, and didn't know what it was at the time. And then it changed. And I got on the track of psychoactive plants. Okay? Don't use the word drug. It's an ugly word. I never did drugs. My generation is notorious for doing drugs. But again, that's part of the perversion and the corruption of the movement, isn't it? You see, the same thing that happened to this genuine sexual desire happened with the desire for cognitive liberty. They were parallel courses.
And those are really important distinctions to make, because there isn't anything that doesn't have a beauty to it. um, and yet when the media grabs a hold of it and decides to shake it into oblivion, it will, and then it destroys all of the good that has transpired from it.
Yeah, we are at war with psychopaths.
Yes, we are.
And these psychopaths are in their end game right now, but they were cranking up the war during my generation. And sad to say that I'm sure that many veterans of my generation are victims of that war. On the other hand, I can say that I trust and I believe firmly that many of those of my generations who did take LSD, no matter what the circumstances, perhaps they weren't as rigorous as mine were, realized something, and it left something in them for the good. It brought them a kind of enlightenment. And maybe we don't know who they are, baby boomers, but they survived and they carried that beautiful gift of LSD illumination into their lives as a benefit. I'm sure that happened too, but you don't hear about that, do you? You only hear about the negative side of it, because that is what those who want to destroy the beauty and power of that experience want to tell you.
You know,
right?
John, I can't help but think about your work, Not in His Image, and what I have learned about the whole pagan culture and the Gnostics, and I mean, this all harkens back to the beauty of that that culture and their knowledge of it and their relationship to nature, and just what kind of threat that was to the, to those who brought the Abrahamic religions forward, and they had to just absolutely destroy anything that was beautiful and loving and linked intricately to nature. And it seems that multiple thousand-year-old destruction continues to be the major warfare against all of us.
Well, they certainly tried to destroy it. The strength of what they were trying to destroy is evident in the many centuries that it took, but it's indestructible. They
Well,
didn't
that's
destroy it in
true.
me. I'm still here. They didn't destroy it in me. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. So if you're someone out there who has anything in common with my history, or maybe you came along a little bit later, just realize that there is that in you, which is natural and indestructible, and it craves beauty and it craves pleasure, which is exactly what the psychopaths hate. So that's what the war looks like. Now, I was talking about my journey into the realm of psychoactive plants, okay? Because LSD, is not a plant, it's a synthetic product. And it's the only synthetic psychedelic, or entheogen, as it's fashionable to call it now, that I ever took. Besides, I think, took some mescaline once. But there was a moment when, funny, I was reflecting on this now. If you'll bear with me, this is going to
By
be
all
difficult.
means.
Yeah. I know that a good way to reach people is to just say what happened, like I told you what happened when I bought Sandoz in the Lower East Side. And that one little anecdote will tell you so much without going into a lot of other elaboration, right? So I'll tell you another anecdote if you don't mind.
Please do.
I was in Santa Fe, and one of my girlfriends was named Wendy, and she was a bombshell. It was a stunning blonde girl with sort of yellow blonde hair that came like down to here. And she was very funny. She was an Aquarius. And so we were friends. She lived down the street from me. And we used to go do things together. So one winter evening, I'm in my tiny little place on La Vereda off 707 East Palace Avenue. She calls me up on the landline because we had telephones back then. And she says, hey, what you doing this evening? I think I'll come up. And she said, great, come on up. So she walks up the street. She comes in. I had a little, tiny little Santa Fe style fireplace. You know what they're like with that kind of round thing? It was just tiny. And I had a little fire in there and it was warm and cozy. So she walks in and she had on this outfit, which was like a astronaut suit. She used to say she wanted to be an astronaut. Well, in a way, she was. And she had on this like shiny kind of astronaut suit, which was a jumpsuit, a one-piece thing, and it zipped up all the way to here. So she came in and she was being kind of coy, and she walked over and stood by the fireplace, and she had one hand behind her and she had her other hand free. And she said, I've got a great idea. Can you see this coming?
I can.
Yeah. And I said, oh yeah, what? And with her free hand, she just unzipped this suit and it just dropped to the ground. And there she was in all of her naked splendor. And then she brought her other hand around from behind her back. And in it, she had a huge bouquet of fresh psilocybe mushrooms.
Oh, 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 wow.
And she said, let's do Tantra. And I said, in a heartbeat, local or planetary? And I remember that incident so well. I haven't thought about it for years, but in anticipation of this talk, it came back to me and I thought, you know, that was extraordinary. Because that was not only the first time that I actually took mushrooms, LSD days were long behind me, but I swear, if my memory is correct, it's the first time that I ever used the term planetary tantra.
Mm.
Just in that lovely joking situation, you see? Everything that we have in us that can only come out through creativity and joy, it just wants to bubble out. It just wants to erupt. And the powers that guide us and show us our true path always reveal themselves in incidents like this, in the delightful little surprises and incidents of life. We're guided toward our true path. And so I began at that time to take an interest in mushrooms, you see. And of course, well, the follow-up of that story is a very long tale indeed, leading to Andalusia, to Infinity Ridge, to telestic sessions with psychedelic mushrooms. And a great deal of my work today and my message, of course, is based on my experience of altered states and what I call Gaian or Tantra-oriented shamanism. So you see? So that's when it began. That would have been around 1974, 75, when I left LA, when I left Washington State and went to Santa Fe. So I did some mushroom sessions in Santa Fe, absolutely beautiful beyond belief, to walk in those arroyos, with the flowering purple asters and the flowering gold sagebrush and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and the impeccable sky. And I started there, and then I carried that experimentation forward to 14 years of practice of shamanism in the mountains of Spain.
So how is it? Is it the connecting with the beauty that is so heightened, that is that shamanistic shift that happens within the psyche? What exactly is it, John?
Well, shamanism, unfortunately, is a word that begins with sham. And there's a lot of shaman in shamanism. But shamanism is basically an essential factor of human culture in those cultures which are animistic. And all indigenous and original cultures are animistic. That is to say that the people in those cultures realize that everything is alive. And however, they also realize something that was defined by anthropologists in the 19th century, which is called the boundary between the sacred and the profane, or the sacred and the mundane. So in all those indigenous cultures in the past, in Europe, the Native American cultures, everywhere you go, the depths of Russia, South America, the people realized that there were supernatural and divine presences living in nature. But in the setting of a human culture where people have to communicate with each other and transact things in order to have a culture, to have a community, a village or a city, you have to set a boundary, and you have to place certain aspects of the supernatural outside, beyond that boundary. Because were you to let them in their full force, society would not be able to function, you see. So Terence McKenna made this observation beautifully when he said that all indigenous societies that were healthy were animistic, and that they understood that the shaman is necessary in the society, the community, because the shaman is the individual, man or woman, who is given the permission to go beyond that boundary, to go into the raw domain of the supernatural, the Nahual, and then come back and bring the benefits of that to the community, you see? So shamanism is natural and innate factor. And again, in the beauty to come, there has to be a place in our societies where this is recognized and respected, and where there are genuine shamans who can do this, because encountering the raw power of the supernatural, I can tell you, is not for everyone. You need tremendous stamina to stand there, and you do stand. The Gnostics called themselves the standing race for a reason. It's not for everyone, but there have to be representatives who can cross that boundary into the sacred and come back into the mundane. Now, I understood these things in a certain way. I don't know, 30, maybe even 40 years ago. But it took a long time for me to find myself in that role and to know the responsibilities of that role. That is where I find myself today. So I consider all that I've learned and the privilege I hold to be a shaman today, to have come out of the experiences of the 60s, even though I did not find them in that generation and in that time and setting. And as we know, the scene was corrupted So I probably couldn't have found it there. But eventually the forces that guide my life led me to it, you see. So I consider that I have fulfilled the mission and promise of my generation in that way. And I'm proud and happy with that outcome.
John, how are people able to tap into that? As you describe, you had your own experiences that brought you to where you are today. How do you work with people to help them gain these insights and into their own lives?
Well, that's not easy to do. Again, the circumstances of our time are extremely unfavorable.
No.
And I think it would be good for me to tell those who are listening that even I don't have the correct conditions to practice this Gaian shamanism in the way that I did for 14 years in Andalusia, in the Serranía de Ronda, which is a sorcerer's paradise up there. And how I miss the vultures, how I miss them. And they were always the guardians of my journeys. And when I got back to Gaucine, because I traveled around Europe, whenever I got back, I got in my car and I drove from Malaga Airport to Gaucine. I came down this mountain road and I turned on this dirt road. And that was the last stretch for me to go home. And almost every time that I turned on that dirt road to the home stretch, they would come over.
Oh, wow.
Vultures, the vultures of Andalusia, the shamanic guardians and allies. And so the circumstances of doing these, what I call telestic sessions, are not easy to satisfy. I don't have a satisfying answer to you if you want to do this. I regret that I don't. All I can say is that I have provided all of the guidelines for doing it in Planetary Tantra. And I've written extensively about my own telestic sessions, how to encounter the organic light, the protocols to handle with the plant allies. I've written a lot about that. I've provided a framework to the best of my ability for those who want to undertake some experimentation with these plant allies. But the place and the setting is tremendously important. And it needs to be in a place of wild nature, ideally, of savage beauty. And it's not easy to meet these conditions. So I know I myself feel a certain sense of dissatisfaction and maybe even inadequacy, that I can't just say, yeah, here, you want to go there, you want to do this, this is how you do it. But nevertheless, I've done the best I can to frame and guide people into that experience, should they wish to go there.
You know, John, I have friends who have truly done some very sacred work with the mushrooms, and it makes me really wonder, in my own experience with them as well, can we fully open to ourselves without these kinds of experiences? I mean, how far do we travel in our own journey with or without these guides.
Well, there's an expression, I don't know, there's an expression from Mircea Eliade, who wrote the landmark book on shamanism. And it's interesting to know, if you read about Eliade, that first, when he wrote that book, I think it came out in English translation in the 50s. It was a landmark book. You know, when we were doing LSD and people were doing a lot of other substances, which I didn't do, in the 60s, there was almost no information about shamanism and shamanic traditions and practices in the past. Since then, there's been an enormous amount of literature. And he used the term archaic techniques of ecstasy. And there's also a term coming out of the 60s called technicians of the sacred. So to be a shaman is to be a technician of the sacred. And it's not for everyone. However, to answer your question, I don't want to leave people feeling disappointed. There's the question of, well, what about using these psychoactive plants, for instance, liberty caps or psilocybe mushrooms, cubensis mexicana, the golden truffles, which are really something. What about just using them privately and respectfully for my own self-growth, for my deepening of my sense of who I am and my deepening of my connection to nature? What about that, right? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, I mean, well, and a little bit bigger than that is that how deeply are we, you know, everyone is unique, but how deeply can we connect and break open all those, you know, all that programming and all those doors that have kind of defined us and strapped us in like straitjackets over our lifetime? I mean, can we access ourselves? Can we become a fuller self through that process, and perhaps not without?
I'll be as careful as I can be. And I do want to respond to your question skillfully. Make 2 points. First one is, in my experience, the use of particularly the psychoactive mushrooms is not a therapeutic practice. They're not therapeutic. Ayahuasca is therapeutic. But the trouble with ayahuasca is that people take it too many times. You know, they take it over and over again. It's insane. If you take ayahuasca correctly, and I've taken it 4 times, then you only have to take it 4 times or even 2, because the great serpent power of the ayahuasca is a therapist and a healer. So she will not only reveal to you her great serpent power, the Mahakundala of the earth itself, of the Aeonic mother, Sophia, she will reveal herself to you, and she will go right to what it is that you need to be healed. And it's known as a fact that among the genuine ayahuasqueros of South America, it's not supposed to be a visionary plant that you go tripping on. It's for healing, and they're known to heal anything you can name.
Yeah.
You know, they can heal leukemia, cancer. They can heal schizophrenia. They don't heal anything. Sachamama heals it, the spirit of ayahuasca. So the mushrooms are different from her. They all have different functions, and the mushrooms, in my experience, are basically like emissaries. They take you to the court of the queen, you see? That's their basic role, and that's what they love to do. So they're not there for entertainment. They're not there to help you break through your conditioning, get over your complexes. No. And so I really can't say I don't approve of people using them for that. It's none of my business what people use them for. But I don't consider that to be the correct way to use them. So the correct way to use them is to accept that they are intermediaries who will take you to the organic light. And that's exactly what you do in a telestic session with the guidelines that I've described in many writings and talks. It's only one purpose, and that is to go directly to the naked, living luminosity of the earth and encounter it. You see? So, second point, and this is perhaps even more essential. And I want to state this correctly because I've never said this before, I don't think, publicly. You know, I have this strange claim, this strange pretense that I can converse with the intelligence of the planet, right? The aeons of fire. So whatever you think of that is fine with me. But I do have these conversations, and I've conversed with her about this subject that we're talking about right now. And my question was, well, hey, Mama, what you gonna do? What you gonna do about the people who what is this expression you used? It's, I need to repeat your exact words. Something about to contact the depth of yourself. Isn't that what you said?
Yeah, something like that. Mhm.
Yeah. Contact, you said it better, but you know, what you gonna do, Mama, with these people who want that and need that? And yet the circumstances for using psychedelics or psychoactive plants to do that are not easy, and they may not use them correctly. You know, who doesn't want to encounter the organic light once you've heard someone talk about it in the way that I have, which has been extravagant, right? Mm-hmm. And this is what I got. I'll give it to you straight. I'm translating, of course. Okay. Whether or not you have the sacred privilege to gain the grail and encounter the organic light, you can have the same effect of that experience in another way. Does that make sense?
Yes.
The same effect. You can have it even if you never have that. You can have the same effect in another way. And what is the other way? The other way is quite simply to know what you are as apart from who you are. Now, who you are, you can find out by looking at your driver's license or your birth certificate, or ask a friend, ask your mother or your parents. They'll tell you who you are. But what you are, that's an entirely different matter. And what you are is an actor, a character in the living dream of the wisdom goddess. Now, if you can accept that and go into that concept and really find your place, know that you are, the effect of that is the same as if you experience the organic light, and that is such.
Yeah.
And many people are doing that. I can't tell you what a joy it is in planetary tantra and among the Shaktas. We laugh about it all the time. It's the biggest form of entertainment. We talk about the stars and the extras, Don't want to be an extra. And an extra is someone on the set of a movie who doesn't even know what the plot of the movie is.
Yeah.
But when you're an actor in the movie, you're involved in writing the script, you know the producer, you know the director, then you are an actor living in her dream. And that is just as good as the ultimate holistic experience.
Yeah. In our first interview, you were talking about how in the Gnostics world, there was the man and the woman and nature in that triangulation. And
right.
What comes to mind there is that very, the connection to the earth, to nature, to Sophia, our integral understanding of being a part of that. And if that's how I would interpret what you're saying, that we connect with our intimate relationship there, that we are that.
That's what you are. It's not who you are. You see, it's not a self.
Right, it's what we are.
It's a role. It's a role. You're an actor playing a role, you see? But that role is the deepest and most profound realization of self that any human animal can have.
Mm-hmm.
See, you're not just a biological animal, you're also a fictional character.
Oh.
And when you know that role and you invent your own character and you write your own script in her dream, then you're on. That's what it means to be a Shakta. That's what it means to be a devotee of the wisdom goddess. And there's so much to learn about that. And there are people, hundreds of people around the world involved in what I'm telling you about now. To go to Nematta and join them, join the acting crew. Don't be an extra.
That's quite profound, John. We have maybe about 15 minutes left. I wonder if you might maybe summarize some of the main aspects that we've covered today that would be most beneficial for people to take away from this conversation.
Sure. One point I would not want to omit in this talk goes back to what happened to the psychedelic revolution. There are many people who claim that that movement was a CIA psyop. Have you heard that theory?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. And there's a man called John Irvin, Irvin. Now, he interviewed me years ago, I think when Not in His Image came out. And subsequently, John Irvin got on this bender. I think he became a Christian, but he got on this bender where he decided that he would present a case or an argument to prove that the entire psychedelic movement was completely planned and orchestrated by the CIA, right? And he presents a lot of what he considers to be evidence of that, the fact that Wasson, who broke the story in Life magazine about participating in a mushroom ceremony with Maria Sabinas in Mexico, broke the story in a mainstream magazine that Wasson was actually an asset. Well, it is a fact that there was a CIA agent there with Wasson on one of his trips or two. And it is also a fact that a well-known CIA front, I think it's called the Geschichter Foundation, had provided money for Wasson's trip to Mexico. Not that he needed it, because he was ultra rich, connected with Morgan Bank. So all of that leads Jan Irvin and others to think, that it was all corrupt from the beginning, that there was nothing genuine in it, that it was not another ground force eruption, like I am claiming that the sexual revolution was. Also, Timothy Leary, who crossed my path in a way in my life, was said to have been a CIA asset. So the story goes that when he was at West Point as a cadet, and he was thrown out of West Point for being a bad boy, that was all a front, and that actually he was always working for the CIA. And I'll tell you something that's real insider. When I talked to Joanna Harcourt Smith, who was closely linked to Leary and was a friend of mine for, I don't know, 20 years or so, one of the last times I talked to her was when Jan Irvin was pushing this whole thing, which in my mind had behind it the intention to totally trash my generation and me. I mean, I took it a bit personally. Oh, it was not genuine. You were just a dupe. They set the whole thing up, right? So I asked Joanna Harcourt Smith, point blank. I said to her, we have talked for hours and days and months about your experience with Timothy Leary. I helped you write a book about it and get that story out. And I said, did you ever at any time in your years with Leary receive any information that would indicate to you that he had been recruited by the CIA when he was at West Point, and that he was in fact working as a CIA asset? And she didn't answer that question, yes or no. And I thought that was quite revealing. So let's just say, yeah, let's just say Jan Irving is right. So what? So what? It doesn't mean that the millions of people who took LSD and the millions of people who opted for cognitive liberty were just dupes being manipulated by a three-letter agency. That's ridiculous. They did it because they wanted to, because they needed to. And some of them learned and grew from it. And it nourished their lives with a taste of enlightenment. You see? So
Well,
I do not buy the idea that the whole generation was a corrupt setup from the beginning. I don't.
and couldn't we extrapolate that to exactly what's taking place today? That was a time of a tremendous explosion and enlightenment. And today is a time of tremendous explosion and enlightenment, where people are attempting to manipulate, and yet we take what we have that's an integral part of whom we are: life, love, our connection, our part of being nature, and we are exploding it into the most tremendous opportunity for us for our own growth.
I couldn't agree more. As horrible as this crime is, the Soviet regime, the Great Reset, the whole PSYOP, there's never been an opportunity in all of human history like this. And it's the end game.
And John, what is the opportunity? I mean, I know I call this a spiritual revolution, a war against spirituality. This is definitely a war against, life and love. And what do we do? Where do we go? What do we do with it?
We go to the finish line. And every one of us goes there in his or her particular way, but we can go there as unity. We can go there in unity. As long as we recognize each other, we share the same knowledge. We know that it's a hoax. And the way I see it, I talk about the 3 R's. 3 R's. I'm not talking about R. pirate coin. But it's funny that there are 3 R's in R. The 3 R's, right? 3 R's. Let's see if I can remember them. These are the goals to be attained in the beauty to come, the goals to be attained by opposing and overthrowing this horrific crime against humanity. Bear in mind that we have a great opportunity. It's not like 9/11. You found out that it was a crime after it happened. You're finding out about a crime in progress.
Now,
See?
yes.
Now. So the first R is restoration. That means restoring life back to the norms of before, but even better, because having had the shock of all of our liberties and common pleasures taken away from us, we will respect and preserve them even better in the future when we restore them. So that's the first R, restoration. Second R is reparation. That means that all the money that is being swindled, because this is an enormous financial swindle.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that has been illegally acquired by various nefarious agencies. All the money of the millionaires, the billionaires, the NGOs, the philanthropic organizations, the foundations, all their money and all their resources is taken away from them as reparation and used to build
Wow.
the next world, the next society,
Wow.
you see? And then there is revenge. So revenge means no mercy, no forgiveness. And anyone who has been accomplice in this crime, from the highest executive level down to the bottom, has no place in the beauty to come. If they continue to live, they will be pariahs. And this is also part of the responsibility to really be brutally ruthless in the outcome. I don't believe that all the good and decent people who are fighting against this can ultimately succeed unless we are brutally ruthless toward the perpetrators. And remember that people who have power never concede it willingly. It has to be taken from them.
Yeah. It takes great courage on every single level, and the courage to stand for our honor and our beauty and life, to be brutal. I mean, it's a very,
That's right.
it's a very profound awareness. Yeah.
Well, she is brutal. She's brutal.
Yeah.
The Earth Mother is brutal. You better believe it.
Yeah.
And Kali is brutal.
Yeah.
If you experience that particular frequency of Kali, it's like the most exquisite tenderness that you could imagine. But there is a brutality inside of it. And that is the brutality that brings us back to the ultimate sanity. And beauty is everything. Beauty and pleasure are everything to our Divine Mother. And when they become everything to us as well, then we're in the next world. Some are there already.
And it is our responsibility to protect them. And if we don't step into that, then, you know, how can we really deserve to flourish in that?
Exactly. Well, that's where the hate word comes in. I wouldn't finish an interview without mentioning the hate word to give anyone a reason to discard me if they didn't have one already. But unless you can hate, you can't protect what you love. Period.
You know, that's stuck in my craw from our last interview, and I certainly
I had a feeling that might have been.
it has, but it's been an integral part of my experiences. prior and since then. And so it's given me tremendous, tremendous thought on that. And I appreciate that, because we, you know, we embody all of these emotions, and without stepping into that awareness of all of it must be a part of this entire experience. We can't just pick or choose. It's a little bit like the Bean story about the village. We can't just have the playful characters that we want in that village. We have to have every single personality that is capable of holding it all together at the times when the droughts come, or the hailstorms, or, you know, whatever the dearths are, or the excesses. And we need to call upon all of that within ourselves and within nature. And it's not a pick
Yeah,
and choose.
hate is integral to a sane human person. I mean, come on, you
Yeah.
know. And hate is not the opposite of love. The opposite of love is indifference.
Yes.
And
The-
indifference or
the
dispassion
psychopaths.
is also very important, you know. To be indifferent to a lot of things is essential. But I think that it's no big metaphysical revelation, Kathleen, you know, who doesn't hate a liar? Who doesn't hate being lied to? Who doesn't hate being deceived? You see? So that natural and innate reaction is called forth by this great challenge we face today. And it's gets worse at the same time that it gets better. Perhaps that's the last thing I could say, because we ain't out of the woods yet here, honey. But we're getting there.
Well, we are, you know,
Yeah.
it's the awareness of what is, that that allows us to dig more deeply and bring forward more courage to look at it with greater focus. And what else can we ask for at this point, you know, than to be curious enough to see what it is that holds us so strongly to love and beauty and life. If we're not willing to stand on that edge of that precipice, if we're not willing to fight for all of this, then what is there?
Yeah, come on. You know, look at it. It's a great adventure. know? We're in a sci-fi nightmare, just like the Gnostics predicted. Aliens have invaded, but they're in our midst. They're within the gates. They're not coming from outer space. They're already here.
Yeah.
And it's a great adventure. It's a great movie.
Yeah.
Find your role in it. I think it's a good note to close on. It's been extraordinary for me to talk in this way about myself and my generation. I've never done this before. Occasionally in some conversations with friends, but I consider those who are listening to be friends. And I want to say it's been really an unusual experience for me to take up this subject, and I thank you for the opportunity to do so, Kathleen.
Well, thank you very much, John Lamb Lash. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.